Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Today is the day we do Mythbusters. Co-host is Chris Rossini. He's also the editor of the RonPaulLibertyReport.com. Chris, welcome to the program today.
Great to be with you, Dr. Paul.
What kind of subject do we have? What are we going to be discussing?
Well, today we're going to mix a little bit of the past with the present. There's a lot of misconceptions out there when it comes to Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton and their views on trade. Many people believe that they're different, but hopefully after this show, our viewers will think otherwise. So if you could just start us off with Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton and what they're really about with trade.
Well, in many ways, philosophically, they're very similar. But when it comes down to the point of how they would use government, they're different. So it's sort of like strategy in a war. They both will endorse foreign intervention, and two candidates could do that. But then their strategy might be a little bit different, but the principle would be intervention. They're both interventionists when it comes to trade. Now, Hillary is supporting the status quo and the trade agreements, something that I've always rejected because of the way they're passed. They're passed by transferring power to the president and letting him negotiate the treaties, and the Congress will then be hands-off. And the trade agreements manage the trade. So it's managed trade, it's not free trade, but they do it in the name of free trade. And they're free trade. They're designed to lower their tariffs. But if you look carefully at that, you find out that they frequently only serve the powerful special interests who have an influence with the NAFTA and the WTO, and obviously want to have the Pacific Trade Treaty. And there's a lot of shortcomings with that, but they try to get away with this, saying this is free trade and everybody loves freedom. But now Trump says no, he's for free trade, but first it has to be fair trade. So he emphasizes fair trade, and he rightfully, criticizes these international agreements. But he wants the government to do something differently. He wants us to become more competitive by not agreeing to these treaties, which a free trader should not endorse because they serve special interests. But it's very appealing now because our economy is in a mess, and we have to blame somebody else. We can't blame our own government, so we have to blame the Chinese and other people for the mess we're in. But somebody like Trump is advocating a very risky position, which we'll get into later because it's been around for a long time, and that's protective tariffs. And the world has lived more with protective tariffs and suffered from it than they have had from free trade. So we've only had, a shorter period of time where there was much freer trade than we've had managed and controlled trade with tariffs. So that's quite a bit different, and of course we'd like to get into the subject of what we should be having as well today. But right now, this is a big issue. Trump's made it a big issue. And he's playing on the disgust that people have, which would include libertarians, that we don't need more government. We don't need these government, entities like the WTO. But if you're going to come up with another government entity, that really doesn't solve our problem. But it's an interesting debate because on the surface, it sort of challenges me when I say, there's no difference between these two candidates when it boils down. But there could be a difference in the use of power, but they're not any different in their willingness to use government power. Sometimes it's strong, powerful national government versus strong international government, but nevertheless, both their policies on trade interferes with the principle of free trade.
Mm-hmm. Let's delve into a fascinating and very important piece of history that everyone should know. Protectionism and cronyism are not new. They've been with us throughout history. But something very important happened in England in the 1830s. There was an association called the AntiCorn Laws Association, and two of their most prominent members were Richard Cobden and John Bright, and these were real free traders. Please, Dr. Paul, explain what this small and committed group was able to achieve.
Well, this is a wonderful story because they were challenging not only their current situation, but also a lot of history of mercantilism. This was the event that really challenged mercantilism, and when the Corn Laws were repealed, it sort of ushered in the age of the Industrial Revolution. But there's always problems with trades during war, and the Napoleonic Wars were detrimental, and the farmers then were having trouble, and they weren't making enough profits, and they thought, well, if you had trade barriers, this would help all the farmers. Sort of like in our Depression, we thought, well, the farmers need to make more money, so we prohibited the farmers from growing corn that could have fed some of the people that were starving. Anyway, they went in the wrong direction, but the Corn Laws were protective tariffs, and they've been on for a long time, but they kept getting onerous. But really, after the Napoleonic Wars, when they ended, something had to be done because people were starting to starve. And the consequence of a policy they sort of got by with for a long time, it was really hurting. So there was a fertile field out there. But they were the ideologues. They had this ideology of free trade. And, of course, Adam Smith knew a little bit about that, and they lived at the same time that Bastiat was preaching free trade in France. So it wasn't that free trade wasn't known, but it wasn't fully endorsed. And they organized like almost a modern-day lobbying effort, and they had to do it without the Internet. But they had these leagues and clubs made, sort of like the clubs that grew up on the Internet when we were doing our campaigning. And they lobbied for this, got a few people elected to the parliament. They never had an overwhelming number of true believers, but the sentiment shifted. The need for the change came, and within a 10-year period in 1846, the Corn Laws were repealed. And I think of this history as being important because the results were very good. And I think really when you're calling for tariffs today, you're actually calling for a corn law. The Corn Laws dealt with putting a tariff principally on corn, but on other things, on a lot of other products, mostly agricultural products. But it was the industrialists that wanted free trade because their logic was, well, if the farmers can't sell their wheat and nobody, the foreigners don't have any money, and we don't trade with them, how are they going to buy these industrial products that the British were starting to build? And once they got rid of these prohibitions, the industrialization of Britain became very prominent, and it ushered in a major era when Great Britain became Great Britain. So it was a significant event. It was one of the revolutions that was a peaceful revolution. Things were very, very bad. They had been fighting those wars, so they moved in the direction of just changing and getting rid of a bad law. So I would think that that, of course, is something we should think about all the time. And although we've done a lot of work on trying to get people to audit the Fed, maybe someday we ought to have an organization sort of built through the Internet of not only auditing Fed, but repeal the Federal Reserve Act. That might motivate a few people to get engaged in our efforts.
Yes. I'm going to read a quote from Richard Cobden. And again, this is from the 1830s. And he said, "As little intercourse as possible between governments and as much connection as possible between the nations of the world." Now, this was an early Ron Paul saying, Dr. Paul, because that sounds exactly like the things that you've been saying. So please explain the difference between quote-unquote free trade agreements like NAFTA and TPP and actual real free trade between nations.
Yeah, of course, I mentioned that, they use the facade of saying this is free trade, but it isn't. It's managed trade. And then the politicians and the special interests get engaged, and they go there for protection. If they're complaining that somebody's underselling them, they say, they're cutting their prices. Then they go and they get permission to put on tariffs. And, of course, that's government making these judgments, and the government literally is controlled by the special interest. So it's really the opposite of free trade. And, it was made very clear over the many years, and especially, at the time of Bastiat, and even our founders understood it, that if goods and services don't cross borders, we find out that armies will. And so this is an important foreign policy issue, too, and yet there's still people now that think that tariffs will be the solution. But this whole idea of allowing individuals to make decisions is very, very important, because that represents people's individual liberty and individual property. I think it's a moral issue as much as an economic issue, because if you're in a free society, you're allowed to work hard and keep the fruits of your labor. And if you have some money, you're allowed to spend it the way you want. So if you're saying to the people who are producing your goods that you like foreign goods better, this is a message that is sent out, and it's your money, so you should have a right to do that. But what happens sometimes is it gets too confusing, because why are the products better to buy overseas if it's due to the fact that there's too many government regulations in our own country? So to me, this is very important, because we certainly don't want to see the troops marching across, and we certainly have too much of that already. But I think that the whole idea of free trade is symbolic of liberty, and it represents a precise definition of property rights are, and voluntary associations. Most people, of course, accept the idea of voluntary associations in a social sense, except recently that's even been challenged. But basically, in religion and social things, we want people to have personal choices. But there's so much willingness, to have control of the economic associations. And that's what we're suffering from. So instead of looking at these principles, unfortunately, they're always looking for government instead of allowing the people to make these decisions. The economy and people making economic decisions sends out very powerful messages. And if the government is abusive to an economy, it should send a message to the people to change their government. If there's too much taxes and regulation and bad currency and all these kind of things, they should be changed. And that's why free trade, even when it seems like people are starting to buy foreign goods, that's a powerful message. I remember in the 70s and 80s, the American automobiles weren't very good, and they wanted to buy foreign goods, foreign cars. Well, the best thing in the world was to have competition, because I think the American companies started making better cars again. It sends a message. But to obliterate that message, I think is very, very bad, and too often people want it that way. They want control, and the people who are making money, through government regulations or getting their protection, it's very tempting to use government power. But just because you shift from nationalization of a control of trade away from international control, the principle is the same. So you have to argue the case for free markets if you really want prosperity.
Yes, Dr. Paul, human nature being what it is, we have a tendency that when we get stuck in a system, and right now we are stuck in a big government system, the tendency is to resist any type of change and to actually fear change. And that's palatable across America. There are many Americans who are terrified of freedom. But let's go back again to when the Corn Laws were repealed. That was a major event. What happened after they were repealed?
Well, the same thing happened in Europe in a big sense that happened, in our early colonies, when they tried socialism at first, and the colonists were dying of starvation. Then they went to capitalism and private property owning, and they started to thrive, and they had more food, and they could export and trade, and people weren't dying from starvation. Well, this is what happened after they repealed the Corn Laws. They ushered in a great age, for the British, and it sent a powerful signal that they didn't need more government regulation, and they certainly didn't need more war. So this whole fact was, an incentive not to have as many wars as going on. Unfortunately, the ignorance is our big problem, because people are now taught more of an economic policy closer to mercantilism, and that's what is encroaching. It's like they want to reinstate the Corn Laws, and mercantilism is good, and if that doesn't work real well, then we have international control. They fear freedom because they have become dependent. They think the government's responsibility is to take care of us. Yet the government's responsibility in a free society is to protect our liberties so that we can go to work and take care of ourselves. But when you turn the responsibility over to the government, people have less incentive to produce, and that's when people get into trouble, and the standard of living goes down. There are more wars, and there's a much worse situation and a greater chances of war and the troops moving across borders. So I think that is an important point, that people fear freedom. And your point is that something that is new and different. Isn't that strange that we might say that in America? Well, the American people are fearful of liberty. But it's sad that that is the case, because we're supposed to be the champions of liberty. But people who grow up in this country, I think some people who come to this country who understand the abuses in other countries understand exactly what liberty is, and they want a chance to make a living. But the American people have grown up for too often. Entitlements are rights, and big business, they make, the Federal Reserve keeps the stock market going, and then there will be a spin-off of that, and the whole society will become richer. So the government is supposed to spend money to stimulate the economy, and deficits are good. But this has gone on for 100 years of teaching generation after generation that dependency is good and government control always worked. But now we're facing the fact that most people are waking up, hey, this isn't working out so good. So you hear this debate between managed trade internationally and managed tariffs domestically for the protection of some individuals. And, the other night when they had a debate, we sort of had a little challenge as we listened to it, is how many times are they going to say liberty and freedom in the debate? It never occurred. It never occurred, so they're not interested in it. Although I think a lot of American people are. It's the leadership. And that's also the reason why there's such chaos in our election today, because it's the same old stuff that they're giving us. More of the same as status quo. Whether you're going back 50 years or 150 years, you're still using bad ideas to run our economy, rather than saying liberty and property rights and free trade is what we really need. So we have a long way to go, but reassurance can only come with a basic understanding and a belief in some basic principle that we have a right to our life and a right to our liberty. We should have a right to keep the fruits of our labor, and that's what America used to be all about. And if that were the case, we wouldn't be having this presidential race as it is today, and such confusion over the trade argument.
Yes. Finally, let's finish up with the cornerstone of all of this, and that's philosophy and the role of government. I'm going to finish up with one final quote from Richard Cobden. Again, this is from the 1800s. He said these powerful words: "Look not to the politicians, look to yourself." And we've come very far from that. Just yesterday, I was watching the hurricane news, and the governor of Florida was telling people to charge their phones and remember their medicines. I mean, it was so nanny-like. So, Dr. Paul, please talk about how philosophy and what the role of government, how that has to change in America.
That's part of the dependency. We become dependent. We think the government's going to take care of us, and they're responsible for the safety net of everything we do socially and economically. They're supposed to make us safe from all these threats of invasion and taking over by foreign powers, which is all building up fear, and people are very fearful. And I think this is the case that people become so fearful that they do turn it over to the government. But we should accept the responsibility of our lives and the responsibility of taking care of ourselves. We've had to go through a lot of hurricanes here on the Gulf Coast. And the first thing they do, and they're doing it in Florida, the incident you're mentioning, they say, get out of town, get out of town. Well, what if I want to stay with my house and protect my property? Well, then you're become a criminal. The feds are coming. FEMA's coming. The military's coming. Get out. And then they come over, and then in New Orleans, it turned out that some of the officials were doing a lot of the robbing and the injury, too. You can't even trust the people who are supposed to come in there to make everybody safe. But the principle of private property is such that people ought to be able to stay with their property and defend it. But they don't want to do that. But this whole principle is based on this fact that we're careless, with the non-aggression principle, that we allow government to use aggression in any way it wants, even especially to take care of us and do good things and feed us and make sure that we're safe and secure. But we should follow this non-aggression. You can't use any force against your neighbor or anybody else, but governments can't do it at all. Now, Bastiat was great on this. He called it legal plunder. The law says the government can do this and are responsible to do this, but it's plunder. And that's a great term. Who would in this country accept the idea that our government is a plunderer, that they take from us? Maybe there are more than I'm alluding to, because I think more and more people are starting to realize that when you look at the tax code and the regulations and the terrible power of the Federal Reserve and all the regulations that are biased to the individual who is supposed to be regulated, and they get to write the regulations in the drug industry and the banking industry. So, yes, I think it's the philosophy of government, and to me, the question that the American people should ask: what should the role of government be? The founders knew and understood the role of government should be very small. It should be to protect your liberties, and the responsibility falls on you. You and your family, your friends and your neighbor, your church, to take care of your problems. And believe me, it would be a much better world. We would be much more prosperous, and we would be a much more peaceful nation. Chris, I want to thank you very much for being with us today to bring us this program.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paul.
Good. And I want to thank our audience for being with us. And please come back to the Liberty Report soon.